Today we're going to hear two of our faculty. One is Dr. David Thomas Murphy, who earned his PhD in history from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in 1992. Yay! And in that same year, came to Anderson University. It's been here ever since. His research specialties are in the history of modern Europe, modern Germany, and the Holocaust. He's the author of 3 books: The Heroic Earth, German Exploration of the Polar World, and Murder in Their Hearts. He has also authored numerous articles. Most recently, Hitler's Geostrategist, The Myth of Karl Haushofer, and the Institute for Geopolitics. Dr. Murphy is going to be talking today about biopolitics on trial, Nuremberg, and the Nazi war on Slavic fertility. So I'd like to call Dr. David Murphy to the podium.
Thanks so much. To begin this, I want to read a document, part of a document to you that I came across doing research on an earlier book. And it's really the root of this research project, or it provoked some thoughts in me that led to this. And then I'll elaborate a little more on where this research is at and what I've got so far. But this is part of a document, a memorandum that was written in April of 1942 by a guy named, by this guy right here, Erhard Wetzel, who at the time was working as what was called a racial consultant to the Reich Ministry for the Occupied Eastern Territories, the Nazi organization that governed at that time Ukraine, Belarus, part of the Baltic states, and others, about 30 million Russians. Normally, Wetzel worked as a consultant on Jewish affairs, but in this particular case, the memorandum that I'm going to read you an excerpt from was written as part of a policy proposal that was later enacted to how to deal with the region's indigenous Slavic population. The passage that kind of struck me goes as follows. And he was submitting this, to a guy named Alfred Rosenberg. I'll show you in a minute. Also one of the top 15 or 20 influential bureaucrats in the Third Reich at the time. And he wrote, "There are many routes which lead to the destruction of a people's biological strength. In the relevant districts, we must pursue an intentional negative population policy. The thought of how damaging it is to propagate many children must be urged upon the population again and again, through propaganda means including the press, radio, film, flyers, short brochures, educational lectures, and so on. It should first allude to the expenses incurred by children, and then to the things one might have procured for the same cost. It could invoke the great health dangers childbirth presents for women and similar matters. Along with this propaganda, there must be large-scale propaganda on behalf of contraceptives in the district. An industry must be specifically created to provide means of such a kind. Neither abortion nor the promotion and distribution of contraceptives should be criminalized in the region. The establishment of abortion clinics should be extensively promoted. Midwives and nurses' aides might, for instance, be trained as abortionists. The population will practice abortion all the more willingly if these institutions are competently operated. Voluntary sterilization must also be promoted through propaganda." That passage, that's an appallingly evil document. And it struck me and couched in the usual kind of sterile bureaucraties of the Nazi hierarchy at the time. And it led me to ask a couple of questions about related to the ideas put forth by Wetzel. First of all, I have them right here, a handy slide. I always forget to use these. Where did these ideas come from? What were the origins in German society in the 30s and 40s of this kind of thinking about race, demography, and politics? How much of this was put into practice and by whom? And then what was known and how was it judged after the war? In English, there's virtually no literature on any of this. There is a small but growing literature in German today. I hope with time to visit a couple of archives in Berlin and Koblenz and then in DC, maybe in 2 to 3 years to have this project culminate in a 350 to 400 page manuscript that I'm pretty sure we'll find a publisher if I can get everything done right. But as far as the first question, the roots of this population, this thinking about population, came from a number of things, a combination of demographic paranoia and racism. European women's fertility rates began to decline really sharply around 1870, and from about 5.2 per woman pregnancies in a lifetime on average to under 3 by 1900. Pretty sharp drop in 30 years, at a time when contraceptives and abortion were outlawed everywhere. So they obviously knew how to keep from having babies. People began to notice that about 1900. The science of demography is pretty new. population politics, and I mean the study of population is only a couple of centuries old. And about 1900, 1910, you start to get books about, why are women having fewer children, what's going on. Some attention to that, not a great deal. It wasn't on everyone's radar in a big way. World War I put it on everyone's radar. That gave a kind of jolt of steroids to awareness, particularly among the defeated nations, about what was happening. That there are fewer and fewer babies being born to our women. What are we going to do about that? That's a problem, and the perceptions of that. Along with that, the war in Germany, as the losing nation, the biggest defeated nation, did a couple of very specific things. Coupled with that, there was a growing kind of influence of racial determinism. Going back to Darwin himself was not really a racist. I don't think that's a fair characterization. But certainly his emphasis on biology as a determinative factor in what we become over the Enlightenment's emphasis on like nurture rather than nature, kind of coalesced with this idea, this awareness of the decline in the birth rate. And Germany is particularly sensitive to it as the defeated nation. And along with that, there is a kind of growing anti-Slavic racism perceptible in German academic writing and later in writing on public affairs and on the kind of new sciences of ethnology and anthropology, which were really burgeoning in Germany in these years, very influential, a lot of influence in the United States. And then a lot of Germans had the experience, men who would become Nazi bureaucrats and German intellectuals during World War I, of fighting in Eastern Europe. And that gave them a renewed and sharpened awareness of something that had kind of sunk below the surface of German national consciousness, I think, in the late 19th century. The fact that there were several million people of German descent, or like me, of partially German descent, living scattered all over Eastern Europe. Many of them still speaking German, many of them not, many of them fully kind of nativized. The Volga Deutsch in Russia were not really speaking German anymore. But there's this new awareness of that too. Look, there may be tens of millions of us out there. All of those ideas are kind of percolating together and to produce the kind of ideas that Wetzel has here. This is a map. It's supposed to show that you can see the German ethnic and cultural soil. This map was published about 1921. And there is a series, every German school book, every kid's geography text throughout, I've studied those extensively, throughout the 20s and 30s and into the early 40s, every grade school, high school, middle school geography text, they all feature maps like this that show, here's Germany itself that is, they think, all German, but there are Germans scattered as far east as the Urals. We're all over out there, peppered in amongst this inferior Slavic population. Later on, it becomes even more aggressive. This is a map from the late 30s when the Nazis are in power. Look, this one tells you there are almost 90 million of us out there if you count all the Germans in Europe and our ethnic soil. And we were the ones, the idea is, if you read what they write, you could see the German farms because they're better tended. The German neighborhoods had better streets. I mean, there's this whole ethos and rhetoric of Slavic cultural inferiority and really tied to kind of biological inferiority as perceived by the Germans as well. Those are some of the roots of the ideas that Wetzel has. There are lots of us out there. The interesting thing about this map, I think, an odd coincidence, is that the extent of the cultural soil, so-called, that they show here, that actually mirrors just about the farthest advance of German troops in World War II. That's just about how far they got. If you were to lay over this a map of the German Reich at its peak, it would almost match this exactly. It's an amazing coincidence. And in the 1930s as well, the Germans twice conducted censuses. They did them every 5 years rather than every 10. And Nazis really ran the 26 and 31 and 36 censuses. And they produced a lot of books. The guy who authored this, who I write a lot about, Friedrich Burgdorfer, was the head of the demographic section of the Reich Statistical Office before the Nazis came to power and after they were in power. And he publicized in both of these lots of books like this, the Vanishing of Birth, The Cultural Illness of Europe, right? And he had others called Volk ohne Jugend, People Without Youth, and so on, pointing out that all of these censuses show German women are having fewer and fewer babies. What's the cause of that? The answer that he proposed, and that lots of other Germans proposed, ironically, there's this kind of agrarian romanticism, it's that we don't have enough room. So the argument becomes we need more space because families out in the rural areas are bigger, and we need more space because our population is getting smaller. I mean, it's kind of a paradoxical reasoning, but that's the big argument in Volk ohne Jugend and all these other books, that the Germans are going through this birth dearth, this decline, because we don't have enough space. We're crammed into cities. They point it out again and again, and we have the highest population density per square kilometer of all the European bigger states, not greater than the Low Countries, but of the major states, that was true. And the German women must be constricting their birth rate and their fertility rates because of this. This is the great argument. So fewer of us means we need more land. This was intensively publicized. This was an extremely well-known argument. This is after the Nazis come to power. This is a public display at a museum in Berlin showing the issue, right? Volk ohne Jugend, people without a future is what this means here. And this is what you get when we all don't have enough babies, people alone in their old age and so on. And there's this kind of agrarian romanticism that if we could just get more space to settle healthy peasants on, the birth rate would go back up. There's a weak correlation there. You know, it's not. There are many exceptions to that. There are lots of cases I could show you where the urban population, the fertility rate matches or even exceeds occasionally. But it is true, more often it is the case that rural populations have a slightly higher fertility rate. They were not entirely incorrect in thinking that. How were those ideas then put into practice by the Nazis? Through a number of organizations. They're all going to be tried after the war, actually. Membership in a couple of these is deemed itself a criminal act after the war. But the Race and Settlement Main Office, these are the main ones, the ministries that were supposed to oversee the East and reorganize it in accord with the thing that the Germans called the Generalplan Ost, the General Plan East. Up to 1942, the war had gone so well, most Germans thought the dream is really coming true. The new order Hitler promised us is really going to happen, and everything between us and the Urals is going to be remade the way that we want it. And the General Plan East called for gradually consolidating all those German populations that I just showed you. They called that Heim ins Reich, the Home in Reichland movement. Bring them all together, gradually put together small cities, 30 to 50,000, no bigger than that, linked by railways and autobahnen and things like that, and gradually work to death and expel the Slavic population somewhere out there in reservations east of the Urals, was the idea of the General Plan East. And a number of agencies were involved in putting this into practice. They also all had responsibility for population policy in the region. There was a lot of overlap in the Nazi bureaucracy has this reputation that's really misleading for great efficiency, and it was actually all the agencies competed viciously with one another for resources and funds and influence with Hitler himself. There was almost open hatred between many of them. So many of them claimed responsibility over this. The main guy, I think, was this guy here. I'll show you some slides of him at Nuremberg after the war, Ulrich Greifeld, who, as you can see, that's the equivalent of Lieutenant General, Obergruppenführer of the SS. And he's the guy that we mostly held responsible for a lot of these policies after the war. He played a role in many of the ministries and bureaucratic agencies that I just showed you. And what did they try to do to reduce the Slavic population growth rate or eliminate it? I would say 4 really main policies, as I see them. The aborting of Slavic babies by the legal status of abortion in Europe was illegal almost everywhere. It was outlawed in the Soviet Union between the wars. It was illegal there. Stalin wouldn't permit it. He felt it hurt the birth rate. The Poles wouldn't permit it. The Germans legalized it in both places very quickly while keeping it illegal in their own country for Aryan women. This is the thing people debate about abortion. They say, well, if you're for it, you're like a Nazi. If you're against it, you're like a Nazi. They're both true and both untrue. The Nazis, frankly, used it to get rid of the kind of people they didn't want and wouldn't let the people they wanted use it. That was the Nazi policy. It wasn't, they were very forthright about it, a very amoral policy, I think. But abortions of Slavic babies by both forced and consensual processes, more about what consent meant in a moment. And this is what they say afterward. A lot of that was consensual. In fact, I'm just going to say right now, okay, I'm a 17-year-old Polish slave laborer, right? A female in a German work camp. And one of the guards wants to have sex with me. So we do, right? And 3 weeks or 3 months later, I tell them I'm pregnant, or they notice it, and so on. And then what happens to me? Well, a couple of things are going to happen. First of all, he's going to refer me to somebody in one of those agencies that I just said. They're going to come and do an examination. If you're pregnant, he's going to say, you know, we can give you a couple of choices. You can't have a baby in this work camp. So, you know, we can deal with it now, or you can be sent to the other camp, right? And so she decides to have the abortion. And they call that consent. I don't think that would stand up in any court of law as a form of consensual abortion today. And in other cases, just outright forced on them. I mean, people, under the guise, German doctors were instructed under the guise of performing an examination to actually abort the child, telling them, we're just going to examine you and then perform an abortion. That, they had orders. I've seen the documents ordering them to do that. That's one policy. Second, large-scale sterilization, again, both forced and consensual. They come to you and say, you've got a record of criminality. You can go to one of these two camps. So we send to this one. To go to that one, you're going to have to be sterilized first. Carried out in a number of ways. Third, alteration of marriage laws. Attempt to inhibit procreation by outlawing marriage until the age of 35 for Polish women, doing things like that, and segregating the men and women by the thousands in work camps and other things. And then finally, and most important of all, racial identity reassignment. Essentially, the kidnapping of kids who look like they might be part Germanic and taking them from their parents and giving them and saying, you're not a Slavic kid, you're really German, and taking them and giving them to German families. And that was the most widely practiced means of doing this. My guess on numbers of these, again, I have a lot of research left to do. I would calculate from testimony at the trials and the documents I've seen, the number of forced and consensual abortions was in the thousands, but not the real high thousands. The number of sterilizations in the tens of thousands. Those were carried out either by doses of radiation or invasive surgery. And then the number of kidnappings of children, racial identity reassignment, that was in the hundreds of thousands. So Yaroslav Kazimir Goromski becomes Karl Groman, and he's sent to a German family. And now Karl, if he uses his old language or uses his old name again, or tries to write to his parents or anything like that, he's beaten, starved, things like that. Those are the ways that they Germanize. And most of these kids, after the war, there were many efforts made to try to relocate families and reunite them, but they were largely unsuccessful. And it's sad to read their accounts. These are tortured people when they grow older, honestly. The other question, I know I don't have a whole lot of time. It's the data on all of this. The Nazis did keep really good records, but they didn't always put it in one place. And there's a lot, for the abortion figures. What I have are individual reports from what they called Eignungsprüfer, which were the suitability examiners sent out by these various agencies. They'd get these reports, and there were hundreds who worked for these agencies, and they'd be told, go to Lidica and check out this pregnancy case and decide, is this one that if we let the pregnancy continue, can this kid be Germanized? Is it what they called racially valuable material or not? And proceed accordingly thereafter. So it's a matter of trying to look at a lot of those trying to consolidate lots of things from lots of different places to get some kind of accurate estimate of numbers on things like that. There was one main office in charge of the relocation of the children, a thing called the Volksdeutsche Mittelstelle, which was the ethnic German relocation center. This guy was one of the guys in charge of it. And they have good records. That we can come up with pretty accurate assessments of how many were affected by this. This is Alfred Rosenberg. We will try and execute him in 1946 with Hitler during the war. He was in charge of some of these agencies. The Nazis are very proud of this resettlement. This says, the largest scale, this is a map also produced for a German newspaper in the early 1940s, the greatest resettlement action of human history. And it was. The greatest migration for the span of times ever to take place in human history was between 39 and 45 in Europe. 60 million human beings moved around in 6 years' time. Many of them by force, many more as refugees fleeing the war and so on. But tens of millions by the Nazis. 7 million Poles made slaves and transported into Germany. Millions more others. After the war, they are, I don't want to impinge on Eric's time. This is the kind of guideline they used. Here's the Nordic man, here's the East Baltic man. These are the sorts of things you would look at to see, is this guy really German or not, even though he says his name is Kazimir Goromski, he's really a German if he has these looks. Their idea of race was so superficial. What's the shape of your eye socket? What's your hair texture? What's the coloration of your iris? They knew nothing of any of obviously all that is in the future, the DNA research and so on. So they went on these purely external physical characteristics. After the war, we tried them. There was the Nuremberg trial that everybody knows of, but after that, the U.S. Military Tribunal had 12 separate trials. This is called the Greifeld et al. Case, U.S. versus Greifeld et al., or called the RUSHA case. It generated about 6,000 pages of documents. That's the records I have to go through for that trial, several dozen rolls of microfilm. There are some good finding aids that make it less than that, but it is still kind of daunting. But they kind of got away with it. Greifeld got life in prison, and he died in prison in 1949. The other 13 defendants who were involved in these organizations, the heads of them, who were put on trial deliberately as a sort of showcase to shame them and send a message to the world, 2 of them got sentences of 25 or 15 years, the 2 guys who had headed the Race and Settlement Office variously during the war. The rest got 3-year sentences. Most of them walked out of the courthouse free because they'd already served 3 years in Haft, in prison since the war. So most of them, they go back into government work. The guy who wrote that article, that document that I read you at the start of this, ended his career as the Interior Ministry for the German state of Saxony, okay, of Lower Saxony. That's, and died, an honored, respected man in the late 1960s. I mean, there are many stories like that I could tell you. But, and one got off completely. The one woman who was charged, Inga Firmetz, who was in charge of the SS orphanage home group, she actually should have been guilty. There were 3 counts: crimes against humanity, crimes of war, and membership in criminal organizations. She, by definition, was in the criminal organization. She belonged to the SS, but all charges were dismissed. The rest got these various kind of slap on the wrist things. It is, there are lots of reasons why I think that failed. They were very aggressive defense. The defending counsels produced twice as many affidavits, twice as many defense witnesses, more than twice as many more exhibits. There was a great effort made to free them. They all spoke at length on their own behalf, saying, "I was just a bureaucrat. I didn't actually sterilize anyone," which was true. They didn't actually hold anybody down and subject them to that. But it was their orders, But anyway, I'll stop there, and we can let Eric take over with his presentation. We can do some questions maybe afterward.
Thanks, Ed.
Yeah.